When I was a child growing up in Tehran, the sky, it wasn't just a sky. It was actually something we listened to. And I don't remember the night that the missile sirens first cut the sky open, but I remember the night the siren sounded and I didn't flinch. Having learned the difference between the sound of imminent strike versus you have a few minutes. And as my family and I used our few minutes to make our way down to the bomb shelter, my mom reminded me, hey, don't forget not to say anything about that new Madonna record to the neighbors in 5G. They were new. In case they were the sort of people who called the morality police just because some female was singing a solo, because women are only allowed harmony in Iran, much less a Madonna record, which is highly, highly illegal music. And she reminded me of this, and I just rolled my eyes because I already knew. I was 10 years old. So that's what we call strength, right? Resilience and stoicism. But is it a little disturbing that I wasn't shocked by missile sirens at 10 years old? And exactly at what point had it become more of a nuisance to get out of bed in the middle of the night than terrifying that my home might blow up? Was I really so accustomed to hiding my truth around unvetted neighbors that my mom's reminder just annoyed me? What if the very reflexes that were helping me survive were also rewriting my character into someone I didn't want to be? What if the same qualities that help us endure can also author our lives if we're not careful? What if real stoicism, true stoicism, requires more than just resilience? Over the years, we've all witnessed protesters on the street, people in the thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands asking for reform, safety, freedom, dignity. And we have watched as those in power showed corruption and oppression were just the beginning, arresting, sometimes slaughtering people armed with nothing more than their voices. At times, I've watched my own people mowed down by live rounds on the streets of Tehran, glued, traumatized by social media, just because watching it was traumatic. But inevitably, after a few weeks of watching this, the most frightening thing of all would happen. The trauma would lighten little by little. I remember, and you tell me if this has happened to you, I woke up one morning to a story on Instagram, and I wasn't horrified by something that should have horrified me. The greatest psychological warning sign isn't fear or panic, anxiety, it's not even rage. It is unnatural calm. The moment we stop feeling what we should be feeling. If you're looking into the void and nothing stirs within you, be careful not to label it resilience too quickly and consider, could this be desperate anesthetizing instead? When you're walking and moving and talking and learning, but more like a wind-up mechanical toy than an actual choice-wielding person, is this a good thing, a necessary state of being in emergencies, or is this a bad thing that risks moral decay? So if this has happened to you, if you have found yourself used to the nightmares of this real world, or woke up one morning having crossed more lines than you ever thought possible, it hardly matters whether the stressor was a missile or a government or just the slow deterioration of your own ethical boundaries. It always happens in a series of small permissions. And then that drift, the drift between who you want to be and who you're becoming, that accumulates in the moments when you seek your most immediate need or desire without asking, whether the action you're taking is congruent with who you want to be. And I want to be clear, this talk isn't about rejecting wise compromise or denying intentional self-preservation. It's simply about falling into that drift by accident. Because those of us that have fallen into it, we're not monsters. We're just so busy trying to maneuver into survival that we fell into this quicksand of drift. So how do you do it? How do you adapt and survive without losing your sense of self, right? How do we know when living with the unacceptable is no longer courage, and because it's become cowardice now? How do we choose our life before it chooses us? This is a question human beings have been asking for centuries, if not millennia. And some of the clearest answers come from a group of thinkers we call the Stoics. The Stoics never believed that your character was fixed. They believed it was practiced, right? Marcus Aurelius reminded himself again and again that your soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. In other words, we're constantly staining ourselves with what we celebrate and what we tolerate and everything in between. The Stoics had a word for the kind of attention this requires, prosoche, which means vigilant awareness, kind of like a mindfulness over your inner citadel. I like to call it a Stoic self-audit, not as an exercise in self-criticism, but as an act of self-governance. And the Stoic self-audit unfolds in 3 steps. First step, define your boundary before it's tested. The philosopher Epictetus called this proheresis, right? That is the moral faculty of choice. And the choice here is, where's your boundary? Where do you decide to draw the line? You decide what's worthy of you, what's beneath you, what you'll consent to, and what you'll refuse. And sometimes that boundary is really clear. If there's a missile falling on your head, you don't stop, right, to think about it. You know where the shelter is. You know what to grab. No parent is holding a philosophical summit in the hallway as the glass trembles in the windows of their children's rooms under missile strikes. That line was drawn long before the sky turned red. The difficult boundaries aren't drawn under missiles. They're drawn when your boss asks you to massage a number, just slightly, nothing dramatic, just a little rounding here, a little delay there. They're drawn when a text message pops up late at night and you already know you've crossed the line you swore you'd never cross. They're drawn when someone new enters your orbit and you instinctively decide whether the Madonna record stays on the turntable or disappears back into its sleeve. They're drawn when speaking up can cost you access, promotion, advancement, or affirmation. These decisions, they should not be accidents. They should be proheresis, moral choices defined in advance. So both the Madonna line and the siren line should be defined before the pressure sets in, because whether the threat is explosive or social, relational or external, the principle is the same. If you don't know who you are in calm water, you will not recognize yourself in the storm. So draw your boundary. Second step, know the cost. The Stoics called this premeditatio malorum, which directly translates to think about the evils before they happen. It's a little confusing, but I'll explain. The first step of the Stoic self-audit is, where's your boundary? The second step is asking, am I willing to pay for that boundary? Because virtue, it's very rarely convenient or profitable. It can cost you happiness, access, it can make you lonely. But if we take the time to rehearse the cost and go over the trade-offs of our line, right? Not so that we can live in dread of the trade-off, but so that we can prepare our nervous system, make sure it is the right boundary for us, not abandon it when we encounter the difficulty. If we can do that, then we can move with greater intention. When the most recent massacre in Iran happened by the government against its own people, I found myself unable to look away, as if vigilance were some form of solidarity. I was just glued. And after a few weeks of this, I started to fray. My sleep got really shallow and my patience grew thin. Even the ordinary sounds of my own home just seemed so distant, as if my kids were living half a room away from me and I'm responsible for their welfare. So before I opened the app again, I had to sit with a harder question. If I keep tuning in, if I let every tragedy, every harm, every video, every horrible story wash through me, will it then destroy my calm here in this space where I am needed? Will I be introducing something negative into the lives of the people for whom I'm responsible? But if I close the screen, if I turn it off because I'm trying to protect my nervous system, what will quiet inside of me? Will my conscience just sort of melt away into convenience? Will guilt wreck my soul? There is a cost to staying open. Without a doubt, there is also a cost to turning away. And unless you have rehearsed both, you're not choosing. You're just drifting into whichever discomfort feels a little bit less immediate to you. So the second step of the Stoic self-audit is sitting with the question, what am I willing to lose to remain who I've decided to be? The third step is acting with intentionality in the moment when the boundary is tested. The Stoics called this hegemonikon. That is basically measuring the space between stimulus and response. This space is your freedom. And it sounds kind of abstract in theory, but in relationships, it's everything. It's that breath you take when a comment landed a little sharply. It's the pause before you laugh at a joke that made you somewhat uncomfortable. It's the minute between your hurt and your withdrawal, right? That space, if we stop inhabiting that space, then the stimulus just becomes a reflex. We either snap because we want to protect ourselves, or we swallow to preserve the peace, right? We tell ourselves it's easier not to speak up than to make a scene, or it's a lot more satisfying to punch this wall right now than to just take a breath and walk away. And little by little, our relational ethics begin to erode. Not because we intended to modify them, but because we fell into that quicksand of drift. That is the Stoic self-audit. Sitting with these 3 steps. Because the reality is, nobody wakes up one morning and says, hey, later this afternoon, I'll just be indifferent to the scandals I encounter and maybe detached from the pain in my own home. Everybody just wakes up and says, I will get through today. I will feed my family, pay my bills, maybe see a friend who makes me smile, because this is how we survive war, oppression, and also the sufferings of an ordinary life. This is how we do it. The issue is when we forget to move forward with intention, and the drift occurs, and we wake up and we haven't protected ourselves against a person who we neither like nor recognize. So remember those 3 steps. Draw the boundary so that any action or inaction is an intentional act of judgment rather than a slow erasure. Rehearse the cost so you don't abandon your line the minute it becomes uncomfortable. I promise you, it will become uncomfortable sometimes. And third, act at the time. This is when we honor the boundary that we set earlier. At the time when the pressure is tested. There is no virtue in shattering. There is no heroism in falling apart. But nor is there nobility in failing to review what we've already grown accustomed to. Because dreams, they don't shatter in dramatic collapses. They erode in small increments of enduring without reflecting. But if we move with purpose, with intention, nothing, not missiles in the sky, not tyranny on the ground, can turn us away from who we want to be, need to be, or dream of being. Thank you.